All right, it's 12:30. So get rolling. Lord, thank you for bringing us together this afternoon. Thank you for all the blessings that you've given us. I pray that you would continue to do so, that you would help us all get through the final week of this semester, get a nice chance to have a break, get catch up with family and friends, and just have a great holiday. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. All right. So it's here, guys. It's here. It's the final lecture of the semester, right? Don't forget to come on Thursday, at least virtually, right, to do your exam. But other than that, like we'll cover the rest of the stuff today, and that'll be that. Um, we didn't have a whole lot of time for questions in the last section, but I also did spend quite a bit of time recapping at the beginning, so I'm thinking that that's probably why. But we'll see how this goes. See how this goes, right? All right. So the recap, right? I did it again. Another perfect class. No misunderstandings. And everybody got it perfectly, right? But just in case, why don't we talk about everything that happened between the last exam and what we've done thus far? Why don't we do that? Connor.
So I was just going to ask about, so on the homework, there was that, I think it was question 11, where it was like, the second order code, and it was like, just be able to tell, like, based off this transfer function, which is it?
Yeah.
And I skipped it just for time's sake, and like, I was going to go back to it, but do you use MATLAB for that, or like, did you like just write it out?
So question 11, where you're given the transfer function and you're asked like pick between these two Bodie plots, there's a couple of things that you want to check. Right? The first thing you want to check is your DC gain, right? Well, the DC gain was the same, right? But we want to check it anyway, right? Because if it's on a different level, that's an easy check and something we can do quickly. Both of them were 0, so that's not helpful. The next identifying characteristic that you have is where the corner frequency is. If you can find the corner frequency, you know where that bend is supposed to be, right? Another way of thinking about this is if you found the resonant frequency of each, right, you would be able to pick that off of the Bodie plot because you just pick the highest point, right? And so both of those require you to find omega n, right? So if you find the natural frequency of each of them, one of them is significantly closer to 1 than the other. So system 1 was the one that did both. Now, could you do it in MATLAB? Sure you could, right? But just from looking at it and decomposing your characteristic equation and figuring out what omega n is, you can get a pretty good amount of information from about which system is which using the transfer function in your Bodie diagram. So it's a good segue. Let's start. So let's do a run through, right? So I'm gonna see if I can make this happen again. You guys, oh, hold on. Yeah, we'll do that. You guys should all see, maybe not you guys. We'll do this. There. Now in the class, you should see this, but also on YouTube later, you should be able to also see this because I think last time I left it in gallery view and you've got to kind of, so this time this should work. Okay. Should be much better. Good thing we figured it out on the last day. All right. So first things first, modeling. We need to know how to do modeling, right? That doesn't go away, right? We need to understand that if you're having trouble with making models still, please come to office hours. Today is kind of shot because my capstone presentation at 3:30, right? So it's right in the middle of office hours. Check. If you need me like after 4, then I'll try to sign back in, but we'll have to, if you're trying to get in and you don't see me, then trying to sign in and you don't get in, shoot a Discord message and see what's up. That'll be an easy way to check, all Tomorrow, no issues, office hours 3 to 5. Thursday, right, that's tricky. I will open up, well, I won't open up officially, and I'll put this in an announcement, but I typically do get to campus around 9, which gives me roughly 30 minutes that I can answer any questions. But if you need me outside of normal hours, you guys know, either Discord or email, and I'll get back to you, assuming that I'm not asleep, right? Which I know, slacker, but tends to happen. Even everybody needs sleep. Even God had to rest on the 7th day, right? So, okay. Now that we've done that, so modeling, right? We need modeling, number one. But more specifically, since the last exam, we've been focusing heavily on frequency response. And the first thing that we talked about was we came up with this equation, right? First thing we did, oh, sorry, not just omega t, but there's a phi there, right? First thing we did is we came up with this equation, right? This equation is important. Why? Because it allows us to get the steady state response of a system to a sinusoidal input, right? And we understand that if we put a sine wave in, we should expect to get some sort of sine wave out, right? If we put a cosine in, we'll get a cosine out. If we put a sine in, we get a sine out. That's what we're expecting. And when it comes to this, right, we know, right? And we know omega t, right? Because we'll be given an input that's something, for example, like 5 sine 2t, right? So you know what omega is and you know what 5. But remember, there's some people out there who want to trick you, right? And they'll tell you that it has an amplitude of like 500 and it oscillates at a frequency of 300 hertz, right? And omega, when using this equation, needs to be in radians per second, right? So you're going to have to convert. How do we convert? We'll multiply by 2 pi to go from frequency in hertz to radians, right? Likewise, if you wanted it to come out in hertz, right, you just divide by 2 pi, right? But it's not really the name of the game here. All right, so anyway, we know omega and we know u naught, so we have to figure out g of j omega, and we need to figure out phi, right? We need the magnitude and the phase. And this is the crux of the first day the first and second day, the first week after our last exam, right? And last class, we talked about this a little bit, right? But we'll do it this way. Here's my imaginary axes. Here's my real axis. So we're in the S plane. And really, what we're looking at, or looking for, well, before we get there, before we get to polar, we'll talk about that too, right? Imagine for a second that I have this vector in my S plane. And this is g of j omega, right? And we know that it is phi degrees, phi radians, phi degrees, whatever, from the real axis, right? That's what we know. That's what we know. All right, so far everyone's tracking with me, right? So that's my transfer function as plotted as a vector, has some real and some imaginary component. And if I know those components, right, I can find the magnitude and I can find the angle. Because remember, all vectors need to have magnitude and direction. And in this case, the magnitude is how big it is, and the direction is what angle it is from the real axis, or phi, right? And we can write this in polar as this, right? And we can see just by using this that the magnitude here has to be, right, has to be the real portion squared plus the imaginary portion squared square root, right? We use Pythagorean theorem. It's a right triangle. And likewise, we can get this angle using the tan inverse of the imaginary divided by the real, right? That's where these formulas come from, right? But remember, this is equal to y of j omega over u of j omega, right? Because the transfer function is the ratio of my output to my input. So we can rewrite this equation in polar as well, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Right. So we can write that in polar as well, right? And if we look at this, we can plot both of these on this axis too, right? So let's do that. Right? And we showed that we can take these terms here, right? We can take phi 1 and phi 2 and what with them, right? Well, if you're dividing them in the exponent to the same power, right, it's just subtracting them, right? So overall, this equation becomes the magnitude divided by the magnitude of u, right? And this is a scalar. These are scalar numbers, right? So that's fine. We're good there. E to the j phi 1 minus phi 2, right? That's what this equation then becomes, right? And so that's why we subtract phi 1 from phi 2 when we do our phase, right? Because this total phase here is equivalent to this, right? So these two pieces combine to make the transfer function, right? And that's the general idea behind this, right? And phase and magnitude are important, right? Because if we were to sweep phase and magnitude through all of the frequencies, what would come out if we plotted it? That's our Bode diagram, right? So taking the generalized version of magnitude and phase and running it through all of the possible frequencies that your system will see to a certain point, right? Eventually, we end up, for most of the cases that we've seen, we end up attenuating by a significant amount after a certain point, right? That's what we get. We get the Bode diagram, right? Okay. So that's magnitude and phase. And if we can do Pythagorean theorem of the numerator and the denominator, right, then we've got magnitude. And if you could take the tan inverse, right, and here's another thing to think about, right? If you're ever like, I can't remember this, right, draw it. Draw the vector of your numerator. In many cases, what do we have? We have a whole number, right? There's no imaginary part. That's going to fall right on the real axis, right? Then the bottom would be something like a real number plus something times j, right? Well, I got a real number and some j, right? I can plot those vectors. I can get the physical representation of what the magnitude and phase look like, right, for specific values, okay? So just consider that, right? Consider that when you're, consider that when you're, if you get in a panic or something and you don't remember exactly what to do, okay? You can always draw it and it just becomes a triangle problem, right? Okay. So that's why steady state, right? And why steady state's important because we want to know how machines and various other things behave for the long term, right? For the long term. Right, so here, I want to talk about magnitude and phase, right? So on the top one, I have my magnitude plot in decibels. Here's something, right? Remember, recall. The magnitude, G of J omega, in decibels. How do I find that? How do I convert from magnitude to magnitude in decibels? What do I do? There it is, right? 20 times log base 10 of G, magnitude of G of J omega, right? That's what we have to do. But what if I want to go back the other way, right? What if I'm given that in decibels, right? And I want G of J omega, right? I just want it in unitless, right? And I'm sorry that that's a little bit, try to get that better on screen for a second. Oh, the earthquake, guys, earthquake. There we go. All right, so if I had to solve this for G of J omega, magnitude G of J omega, what would I have to do? Well, I'd have to divide both sides by 20, right? And then raise it to the 10th power, right? So it's 10 to the magnitude of G of J omega in decibels divided by 20. And that's how we go back the other way. And that's going to be important, right? Because we did an example in class last time where we were talking about transmissibility limits, right? And when we were talking about transmissibility limits, we had to take the transmissibility that we were given and convert it into dB, right? We also did an example where you're asked for the steady state response of the system at a specific frequency and given a Bode diagram, right? You had to read it off of there. So you might have to convert back, right, to do that equation. We'll talk some more about that stuff. Right. So reposition that. All right, now that we've talked about that, let's talk about Bode diagrams, right? So Bode diagrams are the natural consequence of us doing a frequency sweep. We see what happens to our system as we change frequencies, and we can plot our magnitude and our phase, right? With the overall outcome being that we know all that we need to know about steady state, right? Great. We can draw them, right? But we can draw the asymptotes. Right? We're not going to actually draw the real Bode diagram, right? Why? Well, you could, right? You can go in Excel and you can plot all your different points and you can do it that way, or you can do it by hand. You don't need to. In the real world, if you're ever going to need to use a Bode diagram, you'll use a program to get it, like MATLAB or something else, right? That's just the nature of it. So why do we even bother learning how to draw them, right? Well, remember that video, and I agree with it. If you know how to draw it by hand, you can get a good idea for how the system is going to respond without having to do any calculations, right? You just get a general idea, right? So first order system Bode plots, right? There's a couple of rules that we follow for first order system. The first is that we have a low frequency asymptote at the DC gain in decibels. DC gain is synonymous with the steady state gain, right? The steady state gain tells us that S's are all going to be 0, right? So we take our transfer function, we plug in 0 for S, and we find out what it is, right? Great. So let's assume for this, the case of example here, that our DC gain is this black line, right? It doesn't really matter what the value is, but let's just say that's the DC gain, right? So here it is, DC gain. I'm gonna have to get a new marker. I hope Santa brings me new markers for Christmas. Hope Amazon brings me new markers for Christmas. Ugh. Anyway. So second rule, we have a high frequency asymptote that degrades by 20 decibels per decade, right? So it's a negative 20 decibel per decade high frequency asymptote. Where does that start? Well, it starts at the corner frequency, omega C, which is not to be confused with the cutoff frequency, omega B. Now the corner frequency for a first order system, let's, for our sake, let's say it's right here. We're going to say this is omega C, which for first order system is 1 over tau. Right? So the corner frequency for a first order system is 1 over the time constant. How do we find the time constant? There's a couple of ways that we've talked about in class, right? First one, you find the response, you find out what your exponential is, right? And you find out the time it takes to get e to the minus 1. The second way is to write it in standard form. You write your characteristic equation in standard form, you can read it right off, right? It's the term in front of the y dot, right? So let's say we get this, right? This is now my corner frequency. Remember, for these plots, right, frequency is the x-axis in radians per second. And then finally, now that we know where that is, right, I've got my high frequency asymptote that has a decline of negative 20 dB per decade, right? And if I were to draw this, right, it would kind of follow this, and just for first order, it would just follow this pretty closely. And that's the kind of response you would expect. So again, if you're given a Bode plot and you're looking at it, right, seeing a Bode plot that has this sort of look to it should trigger you to think that's first order right off the bat. Because this is what a first order Bode plot will always look like. Notice there's no bump, right? There's no peak. There's no resonant frequency. First order responses do not have a resonant frequency. Okay? We'll talk more about resonance in a second. Talk more about resonance in a second. All right, does anybody have any?
Is the decline negative 20 or negative 40?
Negative 20 for a first order.
Oh, is 40 second order?
40 is second.
Okay, gotcha.
60 is third, 80 is fourth. It's another, every time you add an order to the system, to the characteristic equation, your magnitude high frequency asymptote gets an additional negative 20. Okay. Right, so that's first order. What about our phase? Let's talk about phase. Phase goes from 0 to minus 90 degrees. And it crosses negative 45 at the corner frequency, right? And then we just have behavior that looks like that, right? It's like this reverse S curve, right? That accompanies it. I realize that looks like it peaks at the beginning. It's supposed to be flat. The board is warped. All right. Okay, so that's first order. Second order, all right. So, all right, questions on first order Bode plots? Chris. Sure. So what is standard form for a first order equation, right? So tau y dot plus y is equal to a u of t, right? That's a tau. I know it's hard to see on the board. My marker is, it's holding on, just barely. We're gonna have to switch to 0G classroom so that my markers don't get affected like this. You guys know that NASA spent millions of dollars developing the space pen so you could write with a pen in space. The Russians just used the pencil. All right. So that's standard form, right? And if you have it in this form, right, if you had something in front of the C or instead of in front of the Y, you just divide everything by whatever that coefficient is to get yourself in the standard form, right? And then you get tau, and you're good. Okay. You could also, third way to find tau, you find the roots and you take 1 over the root, that's tau, right? 1 over your root is tau for first order system. Oh, man. All right, so second order system. Well, it turns out we're still going to have a low frequency asymptote at DC gain, right? So let's, this might get messy, but we're going to try it anyway, right? So instead of using the black line, I'm going to draw a blue line slightly below, right? This is my new DC gain here, right? Just to kind of separate these things, okay? So the blue line is the DC gain for the second order system, right? So we'll put that over here, DC, not DG, DC gain, second order. Okay. So same deal, right? Now we've got a high frequency asymptote that happens at minus 40 decibels per decade, right? Yeah. We just talked about that. But where does that happen? Well, it happens at the corner frequency, right? So how do we find that? Well, it's pretty simple for a second order system. The corner frequency is the natural frequency. So if you can find the natural frequency, you know the corner frequency. So for this particular one, let's assume that our natural frequency for our second order system is this brown line, right? Omega n equals omega c. Okay. How do we find that? Well, again, if you have the standard form, right? X double dot plus 2 zeta omega n x dot plus omega n squared, right? So if you have a second order characteristic equation and you divide out your mass term in a mechanical system, you would be left with the standard form, right? So you're gonna clear the coefficient from the second order term, and what you're left with gives you standard form, and whatever term doesn't have an x or an I or an E or whatever your variable is, right, is your omega n, right? Omega n squared. Right, so here it is, omega n, and we'll have a line that decays, and I know this is sloppy looking, minus 40 dB per decade, right? What does this dB per decade mean? Right, remember that means that every 10 tick marks from there, you will lose 20 or 40 dB depending on whether you're first or second order. Okay, so yeah. If you had log paper, it's nice to draw it. If you don't have log paper, right, do the best you can. But the easiest way to do it on the exam is draw a line and then tell me what the slope is going to be, right? Whether it's negative 20 or negative 40, I'll believe you. I'm not gonna check it. He says before he checks it. Okay. So what about phase, right? Phase goes from 0 to minus 180. And it crosses minus 90 at the corner frequency. And the steepness of this part of the curve, right before it enters the minus 90 phase, depends on the damping ratio. But if you just draw it like that for an asymptote, that's fine, right? What should we know, right? Is it high or is it low damping that gives us the highest, the sharpest entry there? Do we remember? case we don't remember. In case we don't remember, take a look here. There it is. As damping ratio increases, we will flatten out our phase, right? So what does this physically mean for us, right? This means that the more damping we have, the faster we will lose phase, right? Because look, this curve at the top for zeta is 0.1, that stays fairly flat for a pretty decent amount of time. But then when we lose phase, right? Likewise, we can see this, but we'll talk about the magnitude effects later with transmissibility, right? But as we increase zeta, we flatten out our peak there, right? Connor.
For the phase that's in units of degrees, right?
Yes. Yes. Phase is in degrees. Right, so if you have to bring this stuff back out, right, to do our equation, which we'll talk about right now. Right, so what's something that we can do with this, right? What's something we can do with this Bode diagram? One of the things we can do is we can say, given an input of 500 sine 20t, go into the Bode diagram and tell me what the steady state response is. Remember the steady state equation, right? Wrote it down previously, and we'll do it again. G of j omega, u naught sine of omega t plus phi, right? Come in here, I go to 20 radians per second because that was the omega given. Let's say that's here. I come up to my Bode diagram, I pull off whatever that is, and I say, well, that's G of j omega, right? Except that I've got to convert it from decibels back into unitless, right? Then I plug that in here. I know u naught, right? That was 500 in the example that I just said. How do we find phi? Come in at 20 radians per second. Find phi, come over, what's my angle, right? Convert it from degrees back into radians, right? So multiply by pi over 180, 2 pi over 360. Right? Or half pi over 90. Okay, I'll stop. Okay, so that's basically Bode diagrams, and there's a bunch of other stuff that we can do with Bode diagrams too. Why don't we go through some of that, right? So the first thing that we saw, the first example we did with the Bode diagram, right, is that given an input, you should be able to tell me what the steady state output is just using the Bode diagram, right? I don't have to give you a transfer function. You don't need any of that. If you have the Bode diagram, you have everything you need to build this response, right? Because you have magnitude and phase. Well, assuming I give you an input, right? If I don't give you an input, then you can't do it. So you need to be given an input. It'd be a pretty bad question if it was just like, here's this Bode diagram, tell me what the steady state response is. Then you were like, it doesn't exist because you didn't give me an input. Right. Okay, anyway. We've got this, right? So what does the second order response look like? If you were to draw it, right, it comes across and it peaks and then it comes down, right? So you get that peak. And that peak, you have a very specific name for that peak. What is the name for that peak? What frequency is that happens at that peak? The frequency for maximum amplitude is?
Is it resonance?
It is. It's the resonance, the resonant frequency. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about the ramifications of resonance in a second when we talk about transmissibility. But, right, that's the resonant peak, right? And we have an equation for resonance, right? We have an equation for resonance. We can calculate it by hand if we want, right? I'm running out of room here. Let's do it over here. You know what? I'm just going to erase this. So we have an equation for resonance, right? So there's a couple ways we can find resonance. The first is if you're given a Bode diagram, you literally read it right off there, right? You go to where the peak is, you estimate, just drop straight down, read the frequency, right? Or we can use this equation. Omega r is equal to omega n times the square root of 1 minus 2 zeta squared. This, if you're going to use this, depends on you having the transfer function in standard form and solving for omega n and zeta. The thing about resonance is it will never be at a frequency higher than omega n. It will always be at or before omega n. And in most cases, it's like right before. If it happens at omega n, it's not really good. Okay, you don't want that to happen, because that means your damping is 0, right? Because if you put 0 in here, and 0 damping is not ideal for most systems, right? It's also not realistic for a real world system to not have any damping, even though we've done quite a few without any. But anyway, doesn't really matter. There's this, right? What's really interesting about this is that resonant peaks only occur for zeta less than 0.7071. Any zeta higher than that, and you do not have a resonant peak. It will not exist. Why is that? Because it forces this to be negative, right? And we cannot have an imaginary frequency, so it just doesn't exist. But think about what we just talked about, right? We'll talk about it in a second on the resonance plot or on the transmissibility plot, right? But think about what we just talked about. If I push that, if I increase that damping ratio, right? I flatten out that curve, right? I'll show you again. If I increase this damping ratio, I start to flatten this, right? Notice what happens. This resonant peak disappears, right? So if you have a damping ratio higher than 0.7071, you won't have any resonant frequency. We'll talk about the implications of that in a second. Okay? So you got two ways to find it. You either get it from the Bode plot and grab it, or what? Or you calculate it with the equation. Okay? What about bandwidth? Right? What about bandwidth? Bandwidth is the range of frequencies over which we have an acceptable signal. If you think about it in data, as data processing, right? We will not have lost too much of our data, right? If you think about it as the book uses, says, when we can sufficiently follow, right? When we get a sufficient amount of follow signal out, right? Essentially, the standard is 3 dB, right? We measure bandwidth against a 3 decibel attenuation. So what do? Right? So what are we looking for? We're looking for the cutoff frequency, right? Omega B. It should not be confused with the corner frequency, omega C, right? Omega B is the frequency we're looking for. What is the cutoff frequency? Well, omega B is the frequency at which we attenuate by 3 dB or less. Anything above this frequency, and we have said that we have lost too much. Too much data has been lost. This is no longer an accurate system, right? This is no longer an act, we've lost fidelity in our data, okay? Now for vibrational systems, it's actually not bad, but for, like, for certain systems, filters or electronic systems, maybe, or your internet, right? You don't want to like lose a bunch of data. Okay. So anyway, how do we do it? We find the DC gain. We have to do, first of all, you have to do it with a Bodhi diagram. You can't do it otherwise. Now, it's not entirely true. You could estimate it from your asymptotes, right? If you drew it fairly accurately, right? But for the most part, that's you're just kind of guessing. What do? You find the DC gain, you subtract 3 dB, make a line across, follow it till you hit your Bodhi diagram, your magnitude, whatever frequency you cross at, that's your cutoff frequency, right? Anything below that, and no good. What happens if it pops back up? Well, if it pops back up, you could have segmented bandwidths, that's fine. Most cases, it won't pop back up. Right? So 3 dB, follow it across, find the frequency where you intersect your Bodhi diagram at minus 3 dB, and you're good. Now, when I say minus 3 dB, I mean the DC gain minus 3 dB, right? We did an example in class where we had a DC gain of negative 36, and so bandwidth would be at negative 39, right? So just keep that in mind. Not everything has a 0 DC gain, right? Not everything has a 0 DC gain. Questions on resonance or bandwidth? No? Pretty straightforward. Doing all right? Okay. Well, in that case, no, I don't want that. No, I don't want that. Sorry, I'm trying to pull up the transmissibility plot because as much fun as it is to talk about transmissibility without this plot, it's way better to talk about it with it. So while I'm getting there, what is transmissibility, right? What exactly is transmissibility? Great question. Transmissibility is the measure of how much a system attenuates or amplifies vibration. It's a measure by which how our system handles vibration. And if it is a number that is larger than 1, we will amplify the amount of vibration, right? We will get more displacement out than we were putting in. We'll get more force out than we were putting in, right? And in most mechanical systems, that is not desired. In some electrical systems, that is very desired, right? Case in point is an amplifier, right? A loudspeaker. You want your voice to carry more, you need to increase that gain, right? You want it to be increasing. Okay, so great, right? There's this idea, we've got this number, right? And we define this a couple of ways, right? We said that the transmissibility is equal to the amplitude of the displacement that's transmitted divided by the amplitude of the displacement that we put in, right? Because we define this in terms of displacement, but we also defined this in terms of force, right? And it turns out that both of these have to be the same number, right? You can't have a system that has 2 different transmissibilities at a specific frequency, right? That's not how it works. You haven't changed the dynamics of the system, right? You haven't changed the transmissibility by looking at it in this way. If you change the operating frequency, then yes, absolutely, transmissibility will change, right? But this ratio will be the same. And notice, these are the amplitude ratios. Earlier in this class, in fact, we talked about something that we call the amplitude ratio. Which is this. So if you can find the magnitude of the sinusoidal transfer function, then you can find the transmissibility. what is the transmissibility telling us? This is telling me, if I was to cross multiply here, if I multiply the amount of displacement input times the transmissibility, I will get the amount that I have done, that I get out, right? The amount that I transmit is how much I put in times the transmissibility. That's what it is, right? Now we came up with this really big gross equation for it, right? We did this derivation. We got this really nice looking equation that everybody loves. I know everybody loves this equation. It's some of my favorite equations, right? Some of my favorite people are equations. All right, anyway. So it's this, right? And it's so obvious that it would be that, right? That we don't even really need to go through the derivation. Everybody gets it. But why is this important, right? Because it defines this term beta. And what is beta? Beta is the frequency ratio. It is the ratio of my input frequency to my natural frequency. Okay? And if we're talking about it in terms of this equation, this will allow us to plot our transmissibility versus the frequency ratio for different zetas, right? For different damping ratios, which is, please hold, this plot, which I do not want to try to draw by hand, right? So if we do this, when we look at this plot, there's a few things about transmissibility that we know. Specifically, first, when beta is close to 1, right? When beta is equal to 1, meaning that the natural frequency is our input frequency, you will notice that not good things tend to happen. What do you mean by that, Dr. D? Well, transmissibility being greater than 1 means that I amplify my system response, and I'm operating this at the natural frequency. If I have low damping, right, zeta equal to 0, essentially none, then I get an infinite spike at omega n. This means that by running at the natural frequency, I have amplified I've transmitted my inputs, whether it is a force or a displacement, by infinity, which is very large. It's very large. So I don't suggest doing that. Right? Here's the thing though, as we increase our damping ratio, we flatten that peak out, right? We already talked about it, but as we increase the damping ratio, we're flattening that peak, right? But still, right, running at resonant frequency is going to give you the most transmissibility, right? So for systems that have high damping, this is less of an issue. But systems that have low damping, this becomes very problematic, right? Everything to the left of that bottleneck there, right? So this point right here, this is when beta is equal to the square root of 2, okay? When beta is equal to the square root of 2. Okay. Everything to the left of that point will be, the best you can do is a transmissibility of 1. At beta is equal to root 2, all the transmissibility, regardless of what your damping ratio is equal to 1. Beta being equal to root 2 is not ideal, right? But it's not worst case scenario, right? Transmissibility of 1 just means you get out exactly what you put in, which in most cases, well, it depends on your what you need, right? But at least it's not amplifying, right? At least it's not amplifying. Notice that low frequency ratio, when omega is much less than omega n, right? We also get transmissibility of 1. We get this spike near resonance, then it comes down again. To the right of root 2, that's as Dwight Schrute would tell you, that's where the money beats are. Okay, it's where you want to be, right? Because all of the transmissibility is negative here, all of it. But now the damping ratio trend reverses, right? So you actually want you actually want lower damping ratio to the right of root 2 and higher and lower let's try this one more time. You want a lower damping ratio to the right of root 2 and a higher damping ratio to the left of root 2, right? Because ideally for a mechanical system, we are trying to crush these vibrations as much as possible, right? We're trying to get rid of them. So from a design standpoint, right, what do we want to do? We want to try to maximize omega n. No, we want to minimize the natural frequency, right? How is the natural frequency controlled? By the spring constant and the mass of the system, right? If you can minimize omega n compared to what your operating frequency is, then you will hopefully be above root 2. If you are above root 2, then we want to play with zeta and try to get zeta as large as possible, right? As small as possible. Want zeta as small as possible to the right to really accentuate that attenuation, okay? If you can't get it to be greater than root 2, you want to make sure that your damping ratio is as large as possible so that you can push this down, right? So you should push this down. So you can minimize that resonant peak. Now, real world. So some of you might know, some of you might not, but I have been studying to take the PE at the end of the month, okay? And this exact graph is a question in the PE manual, okay? This exact plot. And what it asks you to do is find the frequency at which the transmissibility is a certain level, given that your damping is half of critical. What's the critical damping value? When are we critically damped? Once 1. So what's half of the critical damping? Got the hard question. What's half of 1? It's a half, right? So you come to this line. You find the transmissibility that they wanted to ask you about. You read it off the plot and you tell them what the frequency is. Okay. So this stuff does come up in the real world sometimes, depending on what you're doing, right? And this is more of a vibration thing. This would be like a machine design issue, right? You want to make sure that you don't go over a certain amount of attenuation, right? We'll talk about it when we get to the case study a little bit more, like why certain things are the way that they are. Well, not why the way they are, but why certain transmissibilities are better than others, right? I can give you a concrete example of that. Wait. I don't think we need any more of this. We went through all this. And I think that brings us to the current class. You guys have any questions on anything that we discussed, that we went through? So, all right, that's that. So you may have noticed in Loud Cloud between classes, I posted one of the guys in the morning class asked if I could put the original homework 6 and 7 solutions in, right? So I gave you guys the mega homework, which was the greatest hits of homework 6 and 7. I put the solutions for actual homework 6 and actual homework 7 in there. So there's a little bit extra study material if you guys want. You guys have any questions No. It's the wrong mouse. Here's the things. All right. In case you forgot, there's an exam on Thursday, so don't forget that. That's a big one. And then the benchmark due on Sunday, right? And the presentation. Remember, some of the questions that people have asked, like how does it have to be high production quality video? Absolutely. Right? You're going to get docked significantly if you don't have at least Adobe Pro. Just look. Honestly, if you don't feel comfortable being on the camera, that's fine. Just give your PowerPoint presentation, right? At the very least, you guys all know how to record your voice while using PowerPoint, right? You can do that. If not, Screencast-O-Matic is a free software that allows you to do a screen capture video, right? So you can do that. Post it on YouTube as a, well, you don't have to do it as a private link, right? But if you do it as a private link, no one else can see it unless you share out the link for it, right? But just on the first slide or in the somehow make sure that I get the link to wherever your video is. If you try to upload an actual video in LoudCloud, I'm pretty sure you will crash the entire GCU network. Pretty sure that's how that works. I would like the next slide, please, PowerPoint. Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about rotating unbalances, like 2 slides, okay? We'll talk about rotating unbalance. We'll get into the case study, and then whatever time we have left between then and well, class ends at 3:30 and 3 o'clock is you guys can ask whatever other questions you might have burning on your brain, all right? You might also have noticed that I posted a bunch of stuff in Discord today. Those are all files related to the case study. You don't need them to do the case study, but if you wanted to play around with them after the fact, you have them. So that's fine. Okay, let me put this back on the gallery view. As much fun as it is to see the whiteboard all the time, I'd rather not. Okay, so what is rotating unbalance? We talked a little bit about this at the end of last class, but it's exactly what it sounds like. It's something that's rotating that is not balanced. Okay? I saw a great example of this on my way to campus today, and it made me think of this class, right? The guy next to me had his hubcap that was definitely not fastened correctly and was definitely not on center, and it looked like it was about to fall off. And it was rotating there, but it was spinning and vibrating. And so what is this idea, right? The idea here is that the mass center and the center of rotation don't align. Okay, so this is spinning at a constant speed, constant omega, right? And my mass center is not aligned with the center of rotation. And so what happens is we have this concept, this idea of eccentricity, okay? And that's the Greek letter epsilon, right? It looks like fancy E, right? Epsilon. And that's this distance right in here that you can barely see, right? Like right here from the center point to where this mass is, that's epsilon. That's my eccentricity. Okay? Great. So that distance is my eccentricity. M sub u is all of my lumped mass, right? But it's not at the center of rotation. Right? It's someplace else. And we're spinning. Right? And look, notice we have our vibration mounts at the base here. Right? We have got vibration mounts as well. Okay. So because we are rotating with a constant omega, this is going to cause a radial acceleration for us. Right? That's going to be epsilon times omega squared. This in turn causes a force to be exerted on the bearings, right? So this is basically a reaction force, right? This starts to rotate, and so these bearings are now subjected to this additional force on top of whatever is happening to the system. And that force is defined here on the bottom here, which is a little bit hard to read, right? But it says F sub R is equal to the mass, right? That lumped mass times epsilon omega squared sine omega t. Right? It's not a coincidence that omega, when it is the angular velocity, has the same units as frequency, right? Because it's the same thing. So what happens here, right? What increases this, right? Well, this amount of force increases if the mass increases, right? The unbalanced mass increases. And that makes sense, right? If I'm heavier and I'm spinning, you would expect that more force would be generated on the bearings. Okay. It also increases if the eccentricity increases, right? So the more I get away from the center, the bigger the effect, right? But what's really driving the bus is the angular velocity. Small changes in angular velocity equate to very large changes in the amount of force that is seen at the bearing. Okay. Now, when you're looking at this, right? Well, just kind of a side note. Every system has this to a certain degree, right? Unless you have super tight tolerances, you are going to have some measure of rotating unbalance, right? Nothing is perfectly balanced, right? But we can get pretty close. You guys all took thermo, you know, or as I call it, Ecclesiastes, the class, right? Meaningless, everything's meaningless because of the second law. Right? That's how, basically, that's how I read it anyway. But yeah, there's something that's always trying to eat our lunch, right? And this is one of those things. Okay, so why are expensive motors better than not expensive motors? Because expensive motors have less rotating unbalance. Why? Because they have tighter tolerances, right? That's basically it. Okay. So vibration isolation and unbalance. So how do we incorporate this into what we know about vibration isolation, right? So remember, we are interested in force transmission and displacement transmission, right? Or maybe both, right? But in general, we want to know, how is this input transmitted to some endpoint, right? So remember, the force transmissibility is Ft over Fr, right? Where Fr is m sub u, mass of the unbalanced portion, times epsilon minus omega squared. Okay. Just in case you guys were wondering, right? Remember, the normal acceleration is v squared over rho, right? Where rho is that's kind of a side note, dynamic side note, right? V squared over rho, right? People kind of remember this and have seen this before, hopefully. If not, it's v squared over rho, right? But remember, v squared over rho, right? This says that it's epsilon times omega squared, right? Well, remember, omega is what? Omega is v cross r, right? Yeah. No, sorry. Omega is v over r, right? This whole thing squared times epsilon, but the r was epsilon, right? So you end up with v squared over epsilon, which is just my radius that I'm right? So it's the same thing. Those are the same things. Yeah. Rho here is not density, but it is it's the radius of, it's not the radius of gyration. Oh man, radius of curvature. There it is. Too many things. But anyway, that's a side note. That's not really important. It's just how we got there from a dynamics point of view, right? Anyway, in case you were wondering. We're going to apply this to our standard second order mechanical system model, right? Mx double dot plus bx dot plus kx is equal to our input force, which in this case is the bearing force, right? This reaction force that we've developed at our bearings, right? So if I develop the sinusoidal transfer function, which seems like a good idea because we're talking about transmissibility, and if we're talking about transmissibility, that's related to the magnitude in some way, right? Then I can do this. Notice, right? Remember, this is the real portion, and this is the imaginary portion, right? So before you do magnitude, right? Before we do the magnitude, we should always make sure that we group and calculate our real portion, right? And our imaginary portion separately before we go into our Pythagorean theorem, right? You don't want any more than two terms in your Pythagorean theorem, right? Why? Well, because it's not a three-dimensional vector, it's a two-dimensional vector, right? That's why. Okay, sinusoidal transfer function, right? So let's solve this, right? We're going to solve this for x of j omega, and we'll rearrange it, and hey, look what happens. That kind of looks like our transmissibility equation with a little bit extra, right? Where we have the total mass of the system on the bottom and the unbalanced mass times epsilon on top there. So essentially, having an unbalanced system increases the amount of transmissibility, right? That's the important thing to see here. Right? If we have an unbalanced system, right, we have in some way typically increased our transmissibility, right? So that seems problematic, right? Because if it's unbalanced now, we have this extra portion and this extra transmissibility that we have to deal with. So Dr. D, are you saying that rotating while unbalanced is not good? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. This is why they need to balance your tires on your car when they put new ones on, or you can do it if you have the equipment in your house, which obviously everybody has, has a lift and the ability to balance tires in their home. Anyway. But in case you didn't. But Dr. D, that's position. You said that we were interested in the force transmissibility. That's what you said up here. Right on. Wait for it. My mouse is not showing me there. It's right here. Right? This is what you said right here. I did say that right there. It's true. I should never have drawn with that. Should never have done that. Yep. See, that's why. Permanently damaged the entire thing. Oh well. It's there. Ooh. There we go. Oh, nailed it. See, told you, proficient in Microsoft Office on my resume. Told you guys. All right, so what do we do now? All right, we said we wanted force transmissibility. Sure. All right, so the transmitted force, I claim, is equal to K plus B times S. All right, so the transmitted force I am claiming is this. Okay. Where does that come from? Well, if F sub R is M sub U epsilon omega squared, right? The stuff that's left is k plus bs, right? So we solved for x of s previously, right, over here, x of j omega, right? So we'll plug that in to our equation. We get this guy, and look, right, there it is. That's what we got. Seriously though, how do we know that that's f sub t, right? I'm going to go back for a second to our original system. Because of this is how much force gets transmitted through, right? So we have a force at the bearing here that we're inputting, and then this is transmitted through the spring and the damper, right? That's why it's BS minus, or BS plus K, okay? That's why. So now we'll go through all these again. There it is. We get this guy. Hey, standard transfer function, right? We have my output is equal to my transfer function times my input here, right? That's what this is. And so we'll give it the transfer function treatment, right? Because I want the transmissibility, right? So I'll just divide everything by f sub r. You know, then look, I'm left with k plus bx over ms squared plus bs plus k. Fantastic. What does it mean? The numbers, what did it mean, right? Okay, well, I'm gonna do some algebra behind the scenes, and we're gonna rearrange and do some manipulation, right, to get everything in terms of beta and zeta, because then we can understand it in terms of our chart, right, our transmissibility chart. And here it is. The transmissibility from as determined through the force transmission, right, is 1 square root of 1 plus 4 zeta squared beta squared over. So why did we have to find x anyway, x of s? We needed x of s so we could plug it in to our equation on the second line on the right, right? That's why we went and got that. So there it is, right? So once again, you need to know beta and you need to know zeta. That's what we need to know. Okay. So it looks slightly different when compared to what? It's slightly different when compared to the original transmissibility equation that we came up with in terms of beta and zeta, right? Will it be more or less for the same beta and zeta, right? That's something we can plug in. Mm-hmm. But just by looking at it, right? Because this isn't. Hold on. Please hold. The original one that we came up with a couple classes ago. They're the same. They are the same. So guess what? Whether you're balanced or non-balanced, right? Transmissibility doesn't change. Your position, the magnitude of your output position and your output force changes, right? It's not really accurate. Right? The ratio of your input to the output, this means that the ratio of your input to the output stays the same regardless of whether you're balanced or unbalanced, right? That's what it's telling you. That's what it's telling you. Pretty neat result. Okay. Do we have any questions on rotating unbalance? So First thing I would say is if somebody approaches you and asks you if you would like some rotating on balance, you politely decline. That's what I would say. Okay. You guys have any questions on anything right now? You can pop into the case study. It shouldn't take that long to do the case study, but we're going to talk about it anyway. The case study is nice. It should give us an overview of everything from the beginning to the end, hopefully. And then obviously nobody really cares about that exam 2 makeup point thing, so we'll probably just skip it. No big deal. Yeah, right. You're like, that's the only reason I came to class today, Dr. D. All right. All right. Any questions on rotating unbalance? Any questions on transmissibility? Any questions on anything that we've done or talked about today so far? Nope. Okay. Well, here is our case study then, right? Just as a heads up, these are all the numbers are actually based on experimental data. The paper is cited in the back of your textbook if you were interested. But what we are modeling here, right, is the vibration isolation system that improves ride quality for a commercial vehicle, like a tractor trailer. Okay. That's used for long distance transportation of freight, right? And our goal is to analyze the dynamic response of the seat suspension. Okay. That's our goal. One second. Having multiple computers is it's throwing me. It's throwing me. How's that different than any other day, Dr. D? That's true. Very good point. Fair point. It's not easy. It's not easy to be so flustered all the time, guys. All right, so what's going on here, right? We've got the seat. And guess what? The seat is connected to the floor of the cab via vibration isolation mounts. All right, so it's got this spring damper connecting it to the floor, right? Then the seat itself, because of the cushion and the way that it's designed, has a spring damper-like quality to it as well. So it is also technically a vibration isolation system. And then there's the driver, right? And because this is a commercial vehicle, right, he's probably should have like his trucker hat on. Right? That's standard issue. But anyway, so we can redraw this, right? We're going to redraw this as a schematic. I'm going to lump all of the driver mass into mass 2. This will have an independent displacement when compared to the seat. We will lump all of the seat mass into a single mass, M1. What's in between the seat and the driver? The vibration isolation system. What's between the floor and the seat? The vibration isolation system. Notice we have an input Z0 or Z0 of T, right? And each one of these masses has their own individual displacement. So think about it in terms of your own car, right? In terms of your own car, if we think about this. If you hit a bump, the floor of the car moves. That gets transmitted up through your seat, which then transmits into you, right? So that's what we're trying to model here, right? That's what we're going to talk about. So in order to do that, we need a free body diagram. And we need our inputs and our outputs, right? Because, hey, it says here, right? Dr. D's number 1 super terrific 5-step method for making models, right? We'll do the first 4 steps and then we'll talk about how to analyze it after that, right? So free body diagram and input outputs, right? So I got the driver and I've got the seat. The driver moves with Z2. The seat moves with Z1. All right, and we know that we've got some input I'll call it Z naught of T here. Okay. Okay. So. Let's think about this, right? And you can draw this in tension or compression, it doesn't matter, but you need to draw it the right way for how you're going to define it. So thinking about this, if I push the bottom of the car, the seat will also move, but I'm going to assume that the seat moves less than the bottom of the car. So this initial system is going to be compressed. Right? So what else? Likewise, I'm also going to assume that the motion of the seat is less than the motion of the person. So that's going to be compressed as well. And then I'm going to flip it, right? Because that whole equal and opposite mumbo jumbo that people are always talking about, right? In this case, my input is Z naught of T, but it is also the velocity. Why? Because there's a damper there, and the damper scales with velocity. And my outputs, all right, well, I'm going to say my output is Z1 and Z2. Ideally, we're more concerned with how the driver responds, right? Well, not ideally, but in practice, right? In practice, we were going to be more concerned with how the driver responds in the seat. Obviously, that's not always the case, right? We want to make sure that the bolted connections on the seat don't come loose or anything like that. That's a different analysis than what we're doing. All right, everybody good so far? Yeah? So let's write our mathematical truths, right? And I'll segment this in half. I'll do all of the block 2 truths here. All right, notice that I used Z. That was intentional because we're going to have to do, oh, we'll talk about that in a second. It's intentional though. So some of the forces for block 1 are on the right, and those for block 2 are on the left. Okay. Saw that? Saw that. Right, so the standard crew, right? Just as a heads up, well, not a heads up, but just as an aside, because I don't know why my brain's thinking of this right now. And the biomedical engineers will have known this from the class they took, I think, last year with Dr. Jones, the biomechanics class, right? Pulsatile, well, I guess it relates to your benchmark too, right? Somewhat, even though you're not required to do this for the benchmark, but you can have pulsatile flow, right? That's how your heart works, right? It pumps blood in a sinusoidal rhythm, right? Pushes some, sucks some out, pushes in, right? So I don't want you guys to leave this class thinking that this is just frequency responses just for mechanical systems, right? You might not be able to, it's also for fluid systems and for heating systems, right? It's just that those are such specific types of systems, right? Like an artificial heart, you would need to understand how the sine wave response of, or the frequency response of the flow is, right? That's not an everyday case, right? Most of the time when we talk about fluid flow for liquids and gases, we are talking about a straight shot, right? Not something that's pulsing on and off. Right? So that's, but just so you're aware, right? It's applicable regardless of whether you've got an electrical, mechanical, you know, fluid or a thermal system. Okay. Let's do our reduction. So it doesn't matter which mass you start with. So I'm going to start with mass 2. In typical Dr. D fashion, I'm going to pick the one with the fewest forces, right, to start with. And if I do that, right, I get something like this, and I can rearrange the whole thing. Get all my Z2s on one side. Call this equation. Great. Fantastic, right? Now, some of you might be having flashbacks to last class when we did that fourth order system, right? And you're like, this is another fourth order system, and this is starting the exact same way. He's going to make us do the transfer function for this fourth order system, right? And it's going to be a lot of algebra, and I don't want to do that. Well, no, we're not going to do that this way. So I'm not going to use a transfer function to model this later. I'm going to use state space. So the benefit of using state space here, in my opinion, there's two of them. First, you don't have to do a bunch of algebra, right? I don't have to combine both of these systems. I can, in fact, after I get the next equation of motion, just leave it, right? Once I get the mass 1 equation, I can then go into talking about my state variables and things. So that's one benefit. The other is it's robust to initial conditions. So if I want to use non-zero initial conditions, which we're talking about the suspension of a car, I might want to, right? Then I can. Okay. So mass 1, M1 Z double dot 1, and this one's going to be a little bit longer, right? Minus. So that's an extra minus. It just didn't fit. Right? Extra term that gets subtracted. So I can algebra this. And you're like, well, Dr. D, some of you might be thinking, since we're doing state space anyway, isn't this a waste of time to make the input-output equations like this? Well, okay. First of all, you're not wrong, right? Because we're going to have to rearrange these anyway if we're going with state space, right? So putting them in this order seems arbitrary. But there's a reason why we're doing this that's going to come up later. So please hold. Your call is important to us and will be answered in the order in which it was received. Dr. D, you're weird. I know. It's great. There. That's done, right? And we already addressed it, but we're not going to combine this. We're not going to come up with the complete fourth order system. Not that it's a waste of time, but just that In this case, I think state space is a little bit more elegant and less time consuming. So, what order system is this? It's fourth, right? We got two masses which are controlled by F equals ma, right? And acceleration is the second derivative term. So we've got two second order systems, right? I've got two second order equations. Do I sound weird now? Good. They either can't hear me or I sound weird. It's fine. Yeah. Okay. So, fourth order system. How many state variables do I need? That's right, Jose. Four. Four of them. As they say in one of my favorite movies of all time, The Fifth Element. 4 stones, not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4. All right, great. We need 4. How are we going to get them? What should we pick? Doesn't matter what we pick. Should we pick anything? I don't know, right? What do we pick for state variables? We could, if we wanted to, right? Okay. Right? You can pick whatever you want, right? Remember, it is not exclusive to any quantity. But the way that I would highly recommend you choose is based on the energy storage of the system. These mechanical systems store energy via potential and kinetic energy, which means they store energy via position and velocity, right? So we should be picking position and velocity. And in fact, I'm going to pick just that, right? So I've got x1 is equal to z1, x2 is equal to z dot 1, x3 is equal to z2, and x4 is equal to z dot 2, right? And of course, I have to have the corresponding derivatives for each of these, right? Okay, there it is. Very good, perfect, everybody. Right, we've got a couple other things that we need to talk about though. I need U1 is equal to Z naught and U2 is equal to Z dot naught, right? And we weren't explicitly told about any, outputs, right? But let's talk about them now, okay? So I said what? I said, well, typically, yes, whereas we can discuss the displacement of the seat, right? If we wanted to, that's not really the end game, right? We want to know how much the person is going to move, right? Because presumably we are designing this with comfort in mind, right? Presumably. So if we are designing this with comfort in mind, we should probably track the actual position right? We should probably track the actual position of the person. But there's another quantity that we need to track as well. And so from my time working in accident reconstruction and even in college, I had a professor once say, you know, what's dangerous is not the position change or the velocity change, but it's the change in acceleration. Okay. Right? In a car crash, you are less worried about the speed that you're going, more worried about how fast you are slowing down. Right? How abruptly is that energy changing? Right? That's what we want to know about. That's what's going to cause the injury. So what we really want to do is track the acceleration of the person. And I don't know why I put Z1. This should be Z2 and X3, guys. Come on. position of the driver, not the position of the chair. I went through the whole thing when I said we shouldn't be tracking the chair, and we're tracking the chair anyway. What's going on here? Come on. Okay. All right, what's the derivative of acceleration called? We know. It's jerk. So we're interested in. It's also one of the things that people are really interested in when designing roller coasters and amusement attractions, right? Mainly because they don't want people to get hurt. Because if people get hurt, then they don't tend to visit your amusement park, unless it's Action Park in New Jersey, which you guys should. There's a documentary about it. You should. I highly recommend. My parents would never let us go. I grew up in New Jersey. They wouldn't let us go. I was sad about it at the time, but after finding out about it later, I was pretty happy that they did. They had more lawsuits than they knew what to do with. I believe it is on HBO Max. I think it's called Class Action Park. I think that is the name of the documentary. Check that out. Anyway, now that I've digressed enough, we've got all these things. So what do we do now if we want state space, right? When we go back to our two equations, right? We write them down, we substitute in our state variables, we solve for the highest order derivative, and then we plop it into our matrix, right? So I'm not going to go through the entire derivation of these equations, but I am going to write the final state equation and the output equation, right? So remember, the equations that we're trying to fulfill here, right, are x dot is equal to ax plus bu, and y is equal to cx plus du, right? That should be enough room. Right, so I know x dot, I know x, and I know u. There it is. So I've got to fill in the other things. And what's going to happen is, well, I know that x dot 1 is equal to x2. So it's 0, 1, 0, 0. I know that x dot 3 is equal to x4. We'll hold on to that one for a second. But what about x dot 2? Well, if we did all of the math, right, k1 plus k2 over m1, negative b1 plus b2 over m1, k2 over m1. I didn't give myself enough room. And b2 over m1. x3 is 0, 0, 0, 1. And x4 is k2 over m2. b2 over m2. Negative k2 over m2. And negative b2 over m2. All right, that's my A matrix. C, if you go back and you look at these equations, the only one that has u1 and u2 in it is the x dot 2 equation. Now think about it. Mass 1 is the only one that has that input, the only one that has z not associated with it, right? The second one doesn't. So that's that, right? And that gave us A and B. Remember that we were trying to fulfill this equation, right? And remembering that the output equation is going to look like this. Speaking of the output equation, right? Speaking of the output equation, I'll have y1 and y2, right? X is still the same, so it has to have the 4 entries. And u is still the same, so it's u1 and u2. So what do I drop in here? Well, y1 was equal to z2, which was equal to x3, right? We wrote that right here. Right there. So that's 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0. How do I know that? Well, if I multiply that back out, I will get the equation y1 is equal to x3, right? Because 0 times x1 plus 0 times x2 plus 1 times x3 plus 0 times x4 plus 0 times u1 plus 0 times u2. What about y2? y2 is equal to x dot 4. But x dot 4 is equal to the bottom line of my previous, of my A matrix, right? So just copy that. And there we have it. Now, the other thing that's nice about state space when compared to a transfer function is that I define the output, right? I define the output equation. If I wanted to track everything, I could. If I wanted that in the transfer function, I would have to find separate transfer functions for each one to find my output. Now, in Simulink, it's not that hard to do, but by hand, it's a pain, right? But I can even do weird things, right? Like momentum, right? You can use momentum as an output. But anyway, any questions on the state space? No. So here are some parameters. These are the ones that we're going to be using. And depending on what time it is when we get to some of the Simulink stuff, which should be soon, we can probably change a couple of these around to see what the effect is on the system. Okay. Overall, though, right, I've got the seat mass at 20 kilograms. I've got the driver mass at 50 kilograms. All right, so I'm gonna say this right now. I feel like that's low for a commercial truck driver. 50 kilograms. I feel like that's pretty low. It's like 110 pounds. Okay. Just saying. I'm gonna go on record. I think that's low. But anyway. All the other numbers come from a study that was done. The paper is in the appendix of your text. So I didn't make up damping and stiffness here. These are actual numbers for commercial tractor trailer. So we're going to talk about this in a couple of ways, right? First thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the impulse response to this system. Because remember, we're going to talk about, so right now we've got the model, and the point is that we want to analyze this in both the time domain and the frequency domain to see what's going to happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with an impulse test, right? I'm going to hit it with an impulse, and I'm going to see what happens. I'm going to see what the natural dynamics of the system are. Right? What is this test modeling in the real world? Well, we'll talk about that in a second, but before we get there, I want to ask you guys a couple of questions. What are the roots of the characteristic equation? Okay. Uh-oh. No, we good? All right. So remember, I'll throw this up here. R, the roots are equal to b plus or minus square root of b squared plus 4ac divided by 2a, right? Good old quadratic formula. But Dr. D, that doesn't help us because this is a fourth order system and the characteristic equation is fourth order, and I can't use the quadratic formula for a fourth order system. That's right, you can't. But what can you do? Oh. Come on. Oh, I was just there. Sorry. Well, what can you do? You can find the second order characteristic equation for each half of the system. Right? And then you can solve those. So if you don't have a fancy calculator that does solving of equations, you can always split it up, right? Because the roots of each part should be the total roots of the system, right? That's how it should work. So if you have two equations split up like this, now, if you were to create the transfer function, right, on both sides, in terms of z1 and z2, right, you would get the characteristic equation and you'd be able to solve for the roots. So what are the roots? Good question. I will tell you them in a second, once I navigate my way back through all of the slides. So what are the roots? If you were to solve for the roots, you would get two real distinct roots and a complex conjugate pair of roots. That's what you would get. So this leads directly into my next question, which is, what type of response would you expect from such a system? What would the response look like?
One of those underdamped ones.
One of those underdamped ones that I've heard so much about. Sure. Would be, right? Because you'd have a stable exponential for two portions of it, right? Distinct real roots mean stable exponential when they're negative. And then you've got a negative real portion and complex conjugate, so you are automatically expecting it to be underdamped. And if you were to give it the old differential equations treatment, you get this, something of this form. Not e to the e, that'd be weird. E to the e to the e. Right, and I'll put it in this form. Cosine some phase shift, that should be 10.5 t, not just 10.5, right? There. Okay. We get something that looks like this, not exactly this, but something of this form. So, question, what is the dominant time constant here? How do we find the time constant? And how do we know if it's a dominant time constant? So how do we find the time constant?
It's the slowest response to get to -1, so it's like 67.6, like you just invert it, and that's your time constant.
But isn't 1 over 67.6 really fast?
Right, but you find the slowest one, so.
Which one is it? What is it?
Is it the 3.7 one then?
Yep. So dominant time constant is 1 over 3.7, which means my settling time is 4 times that, which is approximately 1.0 seconds. Right? Cool. It's a little more. It's close there.
So, in reference to the case study, that means it would take 1 second for like the bump to go all the way through.
So what it means is that after the impulse, it will take 1 second to recover and get back to 0. Right? That's what it means. Once the force is gone, we dip off. It's going to take 1 second for us to recover. Okay, so we found the dominant time constant. Now, what's significant about the dominant time constant, right? What is it? It's this. If you know the dominant time constant for a higher order system, we can then throw out the rest, right? We, as modeling, as our modeling training has taught us, There's no such thing as a fourth order or fifth order system or response. There is a fourth order and fifth order system, right? But there's no such, they don't have a unique response type. It's all a combination of first and second order systems after you get the third order systems, right? The dominant time constant allows us to simplify this because we are saying that the transients of these other parts go away so much faster in comparison to the dominant time constant that we're going to essentially neglect them for modeling purposes. So we're going to simplify this, right, somewhat. We're not really going to because we're not going to do this by hand, but if you were doing this by hand and you had to draw the response, this is how you do it. Since we're doing this in Simulink, it doesn't matter, but this is just tying in all the things, right? We can ignore the C1 term and the C2 term and just use the C3 term. And so we can find out what the natural frequency is approximately and what the damping ratio is approximately for this system. How do we do it? Well, I know this is the dominant time constant. Right? I know this is the dominant time constant. So I'm going to use the portion of my roots that's associated with my dominant time constant. Right? How do I do that? Well, guess what? We go back to the characteristic equations that we got these roots from, and we see which second order term gave us those roots. And it turns out that if you did that, wait for it, you would get that r squared plus 7.3r plus 124.4 is the equation. And you know that in standard form, it's going to look like this. So omega n is 11.1 radians per second, and zeta can be solved to be roughly 0.33. Which is good news because we thought it was underdamped and it turns out that it is. Now, is this going to be the exact natural frequency of our system? No, right? We took a liberty here to figure out what it was. We took a liberty to figure out what it was. But it's going to be pretty close. How do we know that? The other two roots that we discarded were purely exponential. Since they're purely exponential, they lie on the real axis. Since they lie on the real axis, omega is 0, so there's no frequency associated with them. Right? Okay. Any questions on that? So now we can start talking about the Simulink model, right? That was just basically how do we calculate some things given the work that we did with our model, right? Simulink is going to be a lot more, well, I mean, robust is the right word, but it's going to give us, it's going to be less of an estimation, right? When we want to use Simulink. So we're doing an impulse, right? And typically when we're talking about impulses, we talk about gaming our step function into creating an impulse, right? But is that really the most accurate way to do it? I mean, it depends on what you're trying to simulate, right? So let's for a second imagine we are driving in our car, right? We're driving in our commercial tractor trailers as we are all wont to do, right? And we hit a bump, right? And you're going pretty fast when you hit this bump, right? Well, that's going to cause some displacement in my cabin floor. Okay, but we're going to assume that it's not a huge amount of displacement, right? It's like a standard bump. Even a speed bump isn't really super high. Right? I mean, some of them are, and that's dangerous if you get there, right? So I'm gonna talk to you about this triangular pulse. Slightly new. I've never really talked about it. What is a triangular pulse? Well, imagine for a second you're driving and you hit this bump. That's gonna ramp up the amount of displacement that you see until you get to the top, and then it's gonna ramp back down. In this case, we are estimating that our peak displacement is 3 centimeters, and that the bump rate or the slope of that line is 5.4 excuse me, meters per second. And since it's a triangle, on the way down, it will have the same slope. And if we want the duration of the pulse, well, we can figure out the half duration because I know what my maximum is, right, at 0.03 meters. And I know what the rate is, right? So it's basically just finding how far did I go in a certain amount of time. And so I've got 0.0056 seconds, which is half of my total time. Does that make sense how we're doing that? It makes sense why we're doing that. And so we're just trying to create an impulse that's a little bit more meaningful, right? Yes, we could turn on an impulse for 0.00001 seconds or whatever, right? And put it to 0.3 or 0.03 meters, right? But this is a little bit more realistic because you're not just going to see in the real world instantaneous on and off, right? However, right, the impulse would be like super worst case scenario, right? Also causes discontinuities, which are not really good. Okay. So this is the part of the class where I crash the entire meeting by going to the Simulink. So let's start with MATLAB. Okay. And all you guys have these files in Discord. I didn't put them in LoudCloud because LoudCloud doesn't like mat files and Simulink files. And as much fun as it is to zip them and then have you unzip them, it's a lot easier to just have Discord, have them there, and you can download it. Okay, so what are we doing, right? This is going to run my seat triangle pulse model. Notice all my parameters are right here, right? They're just the ones that we defined earlier. All of my notes are on there telling us, what every part does and what we're looking at, right? So I've defined my A and B matrices here. I've defined my C and D matrices, right? These are all exactly the same as we've just defined them by hand, right? I have my initial condition, my initial state. So I've given X1. So X0 is the initial state. It's showing 0 initial conditions for X1, X2, X3, and X4. You can change it here if you want, right? And we can see what that does. But for right now, we're just going to leave it, right? I've got Z dot, Z0 dot, right? These are parameters we just came up with on the previous slide, just defining them. And this is going to run seat triangle pulse, right? So let me pull that up and we can take a look at the model. So here's the Simulink model that's associated with it. Right? So how do I create this triangle pulse? Well, there's 3 parts to it. The first is the initial bump rate. Right? The second is the descent, and the third is the flat. Right? So let's look at flat. 0.05 plus 2 times the peak. So that's when it starts. This is going to go flat for a certain amount of time, right? Its initial value is 0, and its final value is Z dot. This is setting what is my peak going to be, right? Because it's not really a triangle. It's just kind of, it's going to be a little bit flat at the top. Is that how we're making it? The increase starts at 0.5 seconds. So we're driving along for a little bit, then we hit the bump. It starts at 0 and it goes to Z0 dot. And then this is going to be the same. It starts at the flat rate, right? And it goes down by 2 times. It's -2 times Z0 dot. Okay. We add all those together. What comes out is the velocity, U sub 2, right? The velocity is Z0 dot. I integrate this to get Z0, right, the position, and I mux those signals and I put them in as my input vector to my state space block. The state space outputs Y and sends it to the workspace. And that's what's going to get plotted for us in a second. Or I could look at it on the scope, right? And what's happened here is I have demuxed this signal Y and split it up, and we can look at it here. Okay? So, go back to MATLAB. Oops, sorry. I forgot to close the plots that I was using before. So obviously that makes it really fun. There we go. So let's look at this guy first. I don't know why there's a data tip there. Yeah. So what do we have? This is the driver mass displacement versus time. So what do we see? Right, we're driving along half a second, we hit the bump. Guess what? The driver goes up for about 1.5 millimeters, comes down back into the seat by about 0.6 millimeters, then comes up and settles, right? So think about when you hit a bump, right? Kind of tracks with, if you hit a pretty decent sized bump, you go up, down, right? And then settle back. Most of the time you don't really notice things that are really small like that. I mean, 1.5 millimeters is not a lot. It looks a lot more exaggerated here because of the scale, right? What about if we look at the acceleration? That bump causes an acceleration of 6 meters per second squared upwards. Almost a G, right? You almost pull a G of upwards acceleration when you hit that tiny bump. Again, this is why acceleration is the thing that you gotta be worried about when it comes to accidents, right? So same general trend, right? We pop up, we come back down, and then we're this nice smooth curve towards the end. Right, so what happens, just for funsies, it's a good weight, probably like 200 kilos, 400-ish pounds. It's a big hefty truck driver. The standard truck driver weight. Okay. So let's run this. What happens? Position is decreased significantly, right? So turns out that if you're trying to move a heavier mass with the same amount of force, it's not going to move as much, right? Notice by increasing the mass by 4 times, we've decreased the motion by half, right? But here's the thing that might be surprising. The driver acceleration has gone up by, oh no, sorry, for some reason I saw the 0.6 and I was like, yeah. But it's decreased by about 4 times, right? It was 6 meters per second. So a heavier driver, you'll see less in terms of acceleration, which I think also makes sense, right? For the same amount of force. Right. Okay. But there's more that we can do with this as well. Right? There's more that we can do. So let's talk a little bit about the sinusoidal response. Here. I don't know why there's a 2.7 there. We don't need it. Let's talk about the sinusoidal response, right? So what if I had an oscillating input that I was going to put in here, right? So, I mean, the first part of this is exactly the same, right? It's the same model that we're using. The only thing that's different is the Simulink model that we're using, right? So that was triangle pulse. We've got seat sine. Right, and so this one's a lot simpler, right? We have a sine wave, we put it in. What's coming out of that? That's my position, right? My position is going to be 20 millimeters amplitude. I believe that's what I put in. We take the derivative to get the velocity, we mux it, put it into our state space, and then we take that out to our workspace, and we're going to get a plot. Right, so ideally, what do we want to do with a sine wave? Right, what's the big thing that I keep telling you guys about? I want to graph the steady state response of my system. That's what I want, right? So let's do it. I'm going to need a volunteer from the audience to give me a number in a second, because the way that this code runs, as you'll see down here, we're going to need a frequency in hertz. What frequency you guys want to run this at? How high of a vibration we want? I should probably run it twice, one for a high vibration and one for a low vibration.
60.
All right, I heard 20 and I heard 50.
60.
3, 4, 6, 8.
Okay, great. So we'll start with 20 hertz. We'll go for 20 seconds. No, you know what, 10 seconds. And what we get is at 20 hertz, right, you get this frequency, which, take it at its word, that's 20 hertz, right? But more importantly, so that's the floor. That's our input. Our output is the driver. And look what happens at 20 hertz. We get a peak displacement of about 5 millimeters when we put in a sine wave with an amplitude of about 20. And then after about a second, which isn't that what we said our settling time would be? For about a second, we're flat again, right? We flatten out. We've attenuated our vibration. So 20 hertz is actually on the high side here, right? Because that's what? That's going to be 40 pi radians. So 124-ish radians per second at 20 hertz, right? Yeah. What if, and we'll just leave, I'm going to leave that there. Actually, we'll come back. So let's decrease it, right? Let's try to find something really interesting. No, I'm trying to close it so it's not on anymore. Thank you. All right, so let's run this again. Okay, so 20 was high frequency. Let's run this at 2 hertz. 2 hertz. 10 seconds. Now I think we'll get a really nice picture. Okay. Uh-oh. Something happened. Notice the blue line is my input, and we have amplified our vibration. Goodness. Looks like we might be close to resonance at 2 hertz. All right? So we might be close to resonance. Now, for 30 millimeters, right, that's not awful, right? But if you hit a really significant bump, right, or vibrations, well, if you hit a series of vibrations or a series of bumps that were very large times your transmissibility, right, is like 1.5. So 30 millimeters, that's like an inch. That's not that bad. But if you're at an inch, you're going to be at 2.5 inches, right? So, I mean, that's going to be kind of uncomfortable when your seatbelt is on, and it hits your gut by 2.5 inches, or especially if you're the 400-pound truck driver, which it wouldn't be this high for me. But you get what I'm saying. You guys can play around with all the parameters and stuff in here, right? See how changing the damping affects it and all that, right? But we're gonna move to the next part, okay? Which is the final part, the transmissibility. Okay, where is it? I'll close that last one. All right, so transmissibility. This is going to do what you think it does. It's going to take our model and it is going to graph the transmissibility of our system versus the input frequency. So it's essentially going to give us a Bodie magnitude plot just by itself. Right? Okay. So what we see for these parameters that we started with, right? You get what you look around 1.6-ish hertz. We have resonance. Right? What did we pick before, right? For this, we picked 2 hertz. And look, we're right about 1.6. Had we picked like 1.5 or 1.6 hertz, we would have been at nearly twice as much, right? And like we said earlier, at small magnitudes, that's not that big of a deal, right? 20 millimeters, 2 inches is uncomfortable, but it's not going to injure you, right? You hit a significant bump at that transmissibility, and 2 inches becomes 4 inches, 4 inches becomes 8, right? It's doubling, and that's not fun or comfortable for the driver, right? You're going to feel all of the bumps you hit in the road are going to feel accentuated. They're going to feel like they're twice as big as they actually are if you're running at a low frequency. But if you're running at a high frequency, right, you're going to be attenuating all that stuff and you're not going to feel it. Which I think makes sense if you think about the way that it feels when you drive your car, right? You don't feel every bump in the asphalt, but what you do feel is, speed bumps, right? We'll do one more thing here. I'll leave that graph up there. All I'm going to do is I'm going to change my stiffness value, and let's see if I did this right. It will just automatically update the thing. There we go. Hey, so I lowered the stiffness of K1 by half. I lowered the stiffness of K1 by half, and I dropped my transmissibility, right? So design criteria and design, it matters. Right? Your stiffness matters for the overall transmissibility of your stiffness, of your system. All of these things play together, right? And we need to be able to understand how they play together and how changing different parameters actually affects the outcome and the ergonomics of our design in certain cases. Okay. All right. So you guys have access to all those things. We will get back into this now. I've got one more thing, and then you guys can ask any other questions, right? So physical representation of phase, right? We never really went over what is phase and like physically what is the meaning of it, right? So imagine for a second we've got a car on a wheel. We use cars a lot. It's true. Right, we got a car. The body of my car is attached to my wheel via the suspension, right? And there's some input that we're putting up there. So what does the Bode diagram for this look like? It looks like this for this particular system. And I don't want you to focus on the magnitude so much right now, although the magnitude response is kind of interesting for the wheel, right? You have this attenuation of vibration followed by this amplification and then this attenuation again, right? But what I want you to notice is the phase. The wheel and the chassis are always, for the most part, 90 degrees out of phase at any given frequency, right? So what does that mean? At higher frequency, you will continue to be 90 degrees out of phase. So that means that a displacement applied to the wheel is going to feel like it's being applied 90 degrees to the car, right? So you're going to feel it later, number one, right? Because there's lag there. But more importantly, have any of you ever driven really, really, really fast, like faster than you're supposed to? You don't have to answer if you don't want to, right? Right. Fifth Amendment and all that. But if you have, you probably will have noticed that your car starts to shake, right? And it doesn't shake front and back, it shakes left and right. It's because you're 90 degrees out of phase with your wheel. This way, right? Turn that on. Doesn't say which direction, right? That's why phase is a little bit weird sometimes. But phase is more than just I'm lagging behind my input or I'm leading my input, right? There's physical manifestations of what happens when we are out of phase. And this sometimes accounts for strange vibrational dynamics that we haven't thought of with just doing things in the time domain. Okay? So just keep that in your mind when you're looking at some of these, right? That being said, I'm done, guys. That's it for the semester. We made it. It's been a weird one. I really did have a lot of fun getting to know you guys and teaching this class as usual. You know, wish you all nothing but the best. I hope that you are all super duper successful with your senior projects and everything. I won't see you guys in class next semester. But you know, I'll be in my cave, and you know, if you ever want to stop by office hours, feel free and all that. I'll probably lurk in the back of all of your capstone presentations, for like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, just sitting there, you know, watching. But anyway, I won't stop being weird. It's not gonna happen. So, but thank you guys for an enjoyable semester, and that's all I've got. If you guys have any questions, we've got about 10-ish minutes before 3 o'clock.
Dr. D,
Yeah.
on the benchmark, do you want us to calculate the flow rate or just do research for the average flow rate?
Do research.
So do that for the diameter and the flow rate?
Yeah.
All right, perfect, thank you.
Guys, I overshot. Overslept, guys. Do the thing. You'll get the full 30 minutes. Promise. For this thing. Let's get this started because it's almost 3 o'clock. And I forgot that class ends at 3 o'clock. And so I kept talking. You'll get the full 30 minutes. It's not a big deal. Plug in. We'll get rolling.
This only helps our grade, right?
Correct. When you're done, make sure you submit your when you're done, make sure you submit the test mods, but also private message me your answer when you're done. All right. Oh boy.
Wait, is that linked to the exam? I said no, sorry.
Yes.
Oh,
The link to the makeup points.
oh, I see.
Take a picture of your stuff, submit the Word doc to the private form.
Are we good to go ahead and start that?
Start whenever you like. The timer will start once you start it up. Same protocol as before, where you enter your student ID number, right, to start it.
Are we good to go ahead and start that?
Kind of a dumb question, but can we leave Zoom and take that, or do we have to stay on Zoom for it?
Stay on Zoom. Stay on Zoom until. Oh, hold on, 1 second. Sorry, I'm having mic issues. Stay on Zoom until. Stay on Zoom until class ends, and then you can hop off.